Hello and welcome to Dialogue. With the war between Russia and Ukraine now past the 100-day mark, the battle for the control of a key city in East Ukraine continues. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen made a surprise visit to Kyiv last week and promised to finalize their opinion on if the EU will grant Ukraine a candidate status. What would a candidate status mean to the fighting in Ukraine? What is the endgame for the war? To explore these issues and more, I'm joined today by Joav Toker from the American Graduate School in Paris, Mark Sleboda, Moscow-based international affairs and security analyst, and Harvey Dzodin, senior fellow of the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. So the war in Ukraine has passed this 100-day mark, and now the battle is focusing on this very important city, Severodonetsk, in eastern part of the country. I want to have your opinion on the latest battle, how important it is, this city and this region. We'll start with Harvey, please.
Okay. Well, Russia, with more fighters and more resources with the same game plan they use in Syria, they're taking the position that human rights, international law be damned. It's clearly they're winning now in the Donbass region, and this is very important to the whole region and to the world, actually. But that said, I think Russia has already lost in the short and in the long run. The myth of Russian military superiority has been shredded. The Russians thought that the special military operation would be finished in 100 hours, but now we're at 100 days. There's no end in sight. They've lost thousands of fighters and many of the best and brightest of their officer corps. They've created a massive brain drain of their best and brightest young people too. They're international pariahs. They've united NATO and the West. So the saying, winning the battle and losing the war comes to mind, but this conflict is far from over and it's weighing on the whole world, quite frankly.
Professor Toker, so at least I think people would agree this war is far from being over.
Oh, I absolutely, unfortunately, absolutely agree with it. Far, very far from being over. Sure enough, we are all waiting for the battlefield to speak. This is tragic, but this is realistic. And we don't know which way the battlefield may speak. Right now, it seems indeed, locally speaking, in the Donetsk region, and with intensified battles around the city of Severodonetsk, which may, say most experts, fall into the hands of the Russians in a matter of days or maybe weeks, and may certainly mark a very important step. This will be very important, but what would it mean in terms of the long-term perspective of the entire situation? Will that permit sort of a pause which may let the rival parties to sit down, after all, around the table, negotiate with the help perhaps of outside actors? Or would that be just an intermediary step in order to concentrate more efforts on next door regions? We just don't know. I even wonder whether Moscow knows.
Mark, so we can say basically, in the Severodonetsk region, the city, the momentum of the war is shifting decisively in the favor of Moscow. Is that the case?
No, I can't agree with that. The perception that the momentum is now shifting to Russia is only because of a sea tide of just really absurd propaganda presenting the military situation and the political situation in this conflict from the beginning. This is only now beginning to tell, simply because that Russia's and allied Donbass forces a shelling of fortifications that have been built up by the US-backed Putsch regime in Kyiv's forces for the last 8 years have finally been softened up enough that Russia and Donbass forces are comfortable moving in. This has resulted, of course, in incredible casualties that were completely avoidable among the Kyiv regime forces. But it's beginning to no longer be deniable, either in the battlefield or in the Western press. And I have to correct some previous errors of some of my colleagues. First of all, Russia is an international pariah only if you think that every country in the world is part of the West, which it's not. And the rest of the world doesn't share the West's opinion, quite obviously not participating in the West's economic war on Russia via sanctions. The West is not the world, even though they think they are.
Harvey, over the weekend, this EU head of EU, President Ursula von der Leyen, paid a surprise visit to Ukraine, the capital, Kyiv, and she talked about the candidate status or possible candidate status for the accession to the EU of Ukraine. What do you make of her visit and her remarks?
I think it's a show of public and private support from the European Union, but it's also behind the scenes about some hard-knuckled negotiations about steps that Ukraine must take to progress to membership. I suspect she's also talking about where the 27 countries, EU member states, are on this topic, since the national interests and outlooks vary somewhat. For example, Hungary, who tends to be Putin friendly as opposed to many other member states. But because unanimity is required, that's an important consideration. It's a very high bar to get unanimity. And that gives significant power to those who want to bargain on related or even unrelated issues. So in this case, even countries like Denmark, though, believe that Ukraine hasn't sufficiently fulfilled the criteria for applying to join the EU, saying that they need to significantly improve their legislative and institutional framework. And that's actually backed up by Transparency International that puts Ukraine as second in Europe in terms of the corruption index, with Russia being the first. This is just the beginning of a very long, very hard process. And I think she was there to underline that fact to the Ukrainians and also to engage in some negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Professor Toker, if that's the case, this is a long process for joining EU. I mean, even there's a yes to the candidate status that will take several years for Ukraine to be ready to join the EU. So what is the purpose? Does it have anything to do with the war? Will that somehow support the Ukraine, bringing more substantial support, for example, to the Ukrainians?
It is for sure a very long process. Actually, President Macron, for example, of France, just mentioned a short while ago that we speak about a 20-year period time dimension. And if you look at any normal criteria when it comes to economy, when it comes to internal systems, which have to be at a certain standard so that the EU can accept new candidacy, we are really speaking about deep, complicated infrastructures in terms of politics, of judiciary system, of economy, etc. But it is clear that in this dramatic situation of the war, the idea of shaping some kind of innovative candidacy stature for Ukraine, adjusted especially because we are in a war, because we may find perhaps some diplomatic, innovative solutions which may help this diplomatic, political device to arrive at a new equilibrium, at a new balance regarding the war situation. This is why the discussion over a membership, potential membership of Ukraine is relevant.
Well, Mark, you want to respond? And does the EU membership for the Ukraine is something acceptable for Moscow? We believe that Moscow obviously is opposed to the NATO membership, but to the EU membership seems mostly it's about the economic issue, right?
Yeah, I think before November, before the turning down of common security architecture, the refusal of the EU member states to force their client regime, which they hoisted in Kyiv in 2014 to fulfill the Minsk Accords that were enshrined in international law in the UN Security Council, has removed that consideration because primarily for the common security and defense policy, but other reasons, I do not believe that EU membership for the regime in Kiev is any longer acceptable for Moscow's strategic interests. But regardless, this is mostly just a conversation akin to shoveling deck chairs around on the Titanic as the European states panic. And they really have good reason to, because both economically and military, they are losing this proxy war, and they will lose this proxy war. They cannot accept Ukraine into the EU. They haven't even been able to properly integrate the last round of expansions. This ideology that the EU must exist from Lisbon to the Urals and beyond, this geopolitically expansionist ideology is failing. And it's failing dramatically. With the cost of the political and economic costs of inflation, rising energy costs, as a result of the blowback from the Western sanctions war against Russia, there will be no appetite, especially come winter, to bring another some 30 million plus country that is right now the poorest country in Europe on a per capita basis into the EU. They simply do not have the money to raise Ukraine in, and politically they can't accept any more mass refugees or migrant labor into the country. We're already looking that these EU governments are all going to be facing severe political repercussions from a people that simply will not accept double-digit inflation and energy costs that puts everyone into fuel poverty simply because of a geopolitically expansionist ideology into Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Well, Harvey, as you mentioned, do you think there's, it's on the first place, there's difficulty to get every country, 27 of them, to agree to the membership to Ukraine. On the other hand, you do see there's yet to be finished business, for example, with North Macedonia, with Albania, their membership to the EU is yet to be finished. And of course, this recent visit by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to this region, and he pressured Serbia to impose sanctions on Moscow and to recognize the independence of Kosovo. Of course, he received rejection over there. Seems there's a lot to be dealt with inside the EU.
Yeah, there's a lot to be dealt with inside the EU, but even if there weren't, we're talking about this being like a marathon for Ukraine if they were ever to join. And I don't think that's ever going to happen in my lifetime. What we're talking about, it's not like applying to college. Getting into Harvard or Tsinghua would be a piece of cake by comparison. Candidate countries have to meet the Copenhagen criteria, and these include demonstrating stability of their institutions, guaranteeing democratic governance, rule of law, upholding human rights, including protection for minorities, in this case, including Russians. The candidate country also has to demonstrate a functioning market economy, both internally and within the EU framework. These are just some of the requirements. And to do so, they have to harmonize thousands of Ukrainian laws to meet EU standards. It's a very tall order for a devastated country with a high degree of corruption. And while I don't agree with most of what our Russian colleagues said, I do agree that this is going to be difficult, if not impossible, for Ukraine. And at this point, I think that this is a symbolic effort to probably invite them to start to apply to join the EU.
Mm-hmm. Professor Toker, obviously there's, it's understandable there are some disagreements inside a large political body like EU, 27 members. But it seems there's also, some of the divisions are probably very difficult to reconcile. For example, President Macron of France talked about, calling for people not to humiliate Russia. But that was not well received in some of these Eastern European countries, right?
Yes, you are right. When we look at the overall picture regarding the last 3-4 months, we can already state that the level of cohesion or relative cohesion amongst the 27 is highly surprisingly functioning. Amongst the 27 Europeans, we have two major groups. One of them is actually led by Germany, France, and Italy, that believe that there is no alternative to the ambition of cutting the war short. Namely, first of all, let's shorten the length, the longevity, if you wish, of the fighting situation, putting one way or the other end to fighting. And then there is another group of more countries, numerically more countries, the major ones taking this position, which says the war should go on because it is extremely important that the battlefield will speak. I'm referring mainly to the three Balkan countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and Poland, and joining them, by the way, other countries which are not members of the EU, such as Moldavia, for example, right, to which President Macron will be traveling later this week, next to his trip to Romania. And that two groups of countries, of course, do not speak about the same thing, but they will do the maximum, I'm sure about that, in order to exploit any profitable element which may advance the overall interests of the EU, namely of Ukraine for that matter, in order perhaps to find an innovative formula which will permit to ease down on the military situation and the level of suffering of everybody, and perhaps start to design a future formula which may accommodate the interests of both rival Russia and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the side of Moscow, Mark, recently President Putin compared himself to Peter the Great. So there's a lot of, reading, a lot of discussion about that comparison. What do you make of that comparison?
I think it's an incorrect comparison. I think that perhaps when Putin first took office in the 2000s and was seen and was at the time a integrationist with, for integration with the West, events, actions by the US and NATO in the last 2 decades have completely alleviated that. Peter the Great is seen in Russia as the Russian Tsar who opened the window to the West, and the end result of Western actions and Putin's response to that has been a permanent closing of that window. We are seeing an irreversible decoupling economically, politically, socially, culturally of the West and Russia at this point. It is a great decoupling. There will be no return to normal. Certainly not within our lifetimes. We are looking, whether talking terms economic, the last lines are really energy, things that the West cannot currently do without, but Russia is already establishing new connections. This common dependence, interdependence on each other is over. And ultimately, that will be Putin's legacy. Not that he was Peter the Great, but that on his watch, the window through which the West, in many Russians' opinion, infected Russia will be closed forever.
I think Mark has laid out the Russian position quite well. But I think there are some parallels here between Putin and his comparison to Peter the Great. And also, I think Putin has this imperialistic vision of reconstituting, if not the USSR, reconstituting the whole historic Russian empire, starting with Ukraine and then moving onward from there. And so I think this is very worrisome. And also, I don't agree with Mark that this is a situation that this decoupling will last necessarily for almost ever. History has a way of changing very quickly as leaders change. And I believe that because we're talking about nuclear powers, we have to create a situation of getting along to go along.
Well, Professor Toker, President Putin has signed laws basically to laws of non-compliance to the European Court of Human Rights. Obviously, this is another step of this, great decoupling between Russia and Europe. At least the trend is continuing before any signs of, moving closer.
Indeed, and that was the first intervention of Mark in Moscow, in which I could find some points in which I could agree, unfortunately. Speaking about this violent intervention regarding the opening or the scenario of cooperation between Russia and the West. Indeed, Peter the Great was the one who opened it 3 and more centuries ago. But in recent President Putin's intervention, the one which was actually analyzed all over the world with the reference to the way he may pretend, considering himself the modern so-called Peter the Great, President Putin said other things and actually referred to other elements. He spoke, for example, about the notion of the alternative between being a colony or being dominating, namely sort of giving some kind of validity in 2022, into the 21st century, to the notion that actually history does not advance, that actually values, long-range deep values, which were valid in the 16th and 17th century, in times of Peter the Great, in which indeed he opened the way for Russian access to the Baltic Sea, to relatively warm sea, and did some extraordinary, meaningful steps forward for the interest, in sake of the interest of Russian interests. Are we still on the same scale? Are we just pushing aside globalization, modernity? Yes, human rights, as you mentioned in your questions, and some values which had traveled significant mileage over centuries. Are they just stuck somewhere in, in the cellar, and history goes on in a way which could describe what is happening right now in Europe and perhaps elsewhere in the world in terms of fighting so you don't become a colony and you have to dominate, otherwise you are necessarily the one who would be dominated? Is history, our political science and international affairs limited to that today?
Well, Harvey, if you look at the war itself, for example, beside this, overall relationship between Russia and the European countries, Russia and the West, if we look to the end of the war, we don't know when, but the end game, Kissinger talked about aid, and President Biden not long ago also talked about probably they needed to a settlement through negotiation. And recently, NATO chief also talked about that, saying there will be a compromise. Compromise requires probably concessions from some side, even territory. Are we going to see a point somehow Western allies of Ukraine will pressure Kyiv to make some settlement, or in exchange for a peace agreement, probably some loss of the territory?
I think the most important factor here is the time and the clock. As time marches on, and especially as we get closer to winter, things are going to look a lot differently no matter how the war is going. It's nice for Western Europe to think about showing solidarity and shivering in the cold without Russian energy supplies, but we live in a real world and we have to be realistic. So I can see more pressure being brought to bear on Ukraine. And also, I can see the resolve of Western allies falling apart to some extent. I don't know how much, but to some extent as time goes on. Even if we weren't faced with a cold winter, still time, I think, is the enemy of Ukraine at this point.
Mm-hmm. Final words, Professor Toker?
I will just put one element perhaps to wrap up the conversation. I think that whatever the dimension of time will be and its significance, say, over the coming 6 months or 9 months, as the winter period was mentioned rightly so, in terms of the pressure, the objective pressure coming down on the Europeans and the Westerners in general. The question perhaps should be, can we close our eyes for a second and ask ourselves in 40, 50 years from now, when the question will be put, who won the Russian-Ukrainian war of 2022? Was it Russia or was it Ukraine or the West? The answer to this question, we don't know, of course. But I mean, if we can keep that question accompanying us, I think that we would see the right dimensions of what we're speaking right now about more locally in a more parceled way. It's an impossible question to answer, but it's a way of guiding at least what many people in the West are asking themselves and encouraging the political leadership to follow in their policies.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinzhuo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.